The dust of Promise, Nevada tasted like shattered dreams. For Tina Brooks, it was the bitter end of a 2,000-mile journey and the grave of a man she'd never met. She'd stepped off the stagecoach with a worn suitcase and a heart full of letters, promising a new life, only to find her intended Mr. Bartholomew Higgins was 3 weeks buried. The townsfolk offered no comfort, just cold stares and colder shoulders. Homeless, penniless, and a world away from everything she'd ever known, she was a ghost in a town that didn't want her. But then a voice low and steady, as the setting sun cut through the silence. A lone cowboy, his eyes holding the vast, sorrowful expanse of the prairie itself, offered a choice when she had none, his protection. Little did she know, accepting his charity meant stepping into the heart of a storm, for in Promise the dead don't always stay buried, and a compassionate gesture could get you killed. The stagecoach lurched one final bone-jarring time, its worn leather straps groaning in protest as it shuddered to a halt. For 3 weeks, this cramped, musty box had been Tina Brooks's world, a rolling purgatory between the life she was fleeing in Boston and the one she was praying to find in Promise, Nevada. The air that blasted through the open window was no longer the damp, familiar, salt-scented breeze of the Atlantic, but a dry, searing heat that carried the scent of sagebrush dust and something else, something wild and untamed. She smoothed the front of her dark wool traveling dress for the 100th time, the fabric scratchy and stifling in the relentless heat. Her gloved fingers trembled slightly as she clutched the reticule in her lap. Inside, nestled amongst a few precious coins and a small silver-framed tintype of her late mother, was a stack of letters. 10 letters, to be precise, tied with a simple blue ribbon. The paper was thick. The handwriting, a strong masculine script, the words painting a picture of a life she desperately wanted to believe in. Mr. Bartholomew Bart Higgins had written of his successful mercantile, of the neat little house he was building for her at the edge of town, of the endless blue skies and the community of good, honest folk in Promise. He wrote of his loneliness, his desire for a partner to share in the prosperity he was carving out of the harsh western landscape. He didn't write like the stuffy officious men she had known back home, sons of merchants and bankers who saw marriage as another line on a ledger. Bart's letters were filled with a simple, earnest hope that mirrored her own. At 24, after a series of family misfortunes had left her orphaned and nearly destitute, his proposal of a mail-order marriage felt less like a transaction and more like a lifeline. "This is it, miss." The driver grunted, his voice raspy with trail dust. Promise. Tina peered out. The town was little more than a single-wide, dusty street, flanked by a collection of weathered, false-fronted buildings. A saloon, its bat-wing doors swinging lazily in the breeze, sat opposite a general store with the words Higgins Mercantile painted in faded peeling letters above the door. Her heart gave a hopeful flutter. That was it. That was his store, the beginning of her new life. Taking a deep breath to steady her nerves, she allowed the driver to help her down. The ground was a fine reddish powder that immediately coated her sensible black boots. The sun was a physical weight pressing down from a sky of piercing, cloudless blue. Several men loitering on the boardwalk in front of the saloon stopped their low conversation to stare. Their eyes, narrowed against the glare, held a frank, unnerving curiosity that made her pull her shawl tighter around her shoulders, despite the heat. Women peering from the windows of the Mercantile and a nearby dress shop were no less subtle, their gazes lingering with an intensity that felt less welcoming and more judgmental. A stout man with a drooping gray mustache and a tin star pinned to his vest detached himself from the shade of an overhang and ambled towards her. "Afternoon, ma'am. You looking for someone?" "Yes, thank you, Sheriff," she said, her voice sounding small and foreign in the vast quiet. "I am. I'm looking for Mr. Bartholomew Higgins. My name is Tina Brooks." She offered the name as if it were a key one that would unlock the welcoming arms of the town and her future husband. The sheriff stopped, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to something guarded, almost pitying. He took off his hat, wiping a sweaty brow with the back of his forearm. "Miss Brooks," he said slowly, drawing out the syllables. "I'm afraid I've got some bad news for you." A cold dread, stark and immediate, washed over Tina, chilling her far more than the desert heat. "Bad news, is he unwell?" The sheriff shifted his weight, his gaze dropping to the dust at his feet. "Bartholomew Higgins is dead, ma'am. Been dead nigh on 3 weeks now." The world tilted. The sounds of the street, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the low murmur from the saloon faded to a dull roar in her ears. Dead, she whispered the word, a puff of air devoid of meaning. It couldn't be. The letters in her reticule were so full of life of plans. People with plans didn't just die. What happened? She managed her throat tight. "Tragic accident," the sheriff said, his tone becoming clipped and official. "Went out riding. His horse got spooked by a rattler up in the canyons. Threw him something fierce. Broke his neck. Found him 2 days later. He replaced his hat, casting his face in shadow. My condolences, ma'am. It was a terrible thing." Condolences. The word was a formality, a smooth, polished stone dropped into the gaping chasm that had just opened at her feet. She stood frozen, the worn handle of her suitcase digging into her palm, the sole anchor in a sea of swirling disbelief. Her entire future, every hope she had, carefully nurtured across thousands of miles, had been predicated on a man who was already in his grave when she'd stepped onto the stagecoach. The driver, with a gruff sort of sympathy, deposited her trunk on the boardwalk with a heavy thud. "Where to, miss? Where to?" The question hung in the air, as vast and empty as the sky above. She had no answer. She had nowhere to go. She was homeless. The sheriff cleared his throat. I'm real sorry for your predicament, Miss Brooks. Truly. But..." He gestured vaguely down the street. "There ain't much here for you now." The unspoken message was clear. Move along. The stares of the townsfolk now seemed to burn with a new meaning. She wasn't just a stranger. She was a problem, a loose thread in their tightly woven community. An unmarried woman alone and without prospects was a complication they didn't want. A woman with a severe bird-like face and hair, pulled into a punishingly tight bun, emerged from the mercantile his mercantile. She wiped her hands on her apron, her eyes cold and assessing. "Sheriff Miller," she said, her voice sharp. "What's all this?" "This here is Miss Tina Brooks, Martha," the sheriff explained. She was to be Bart's intended." The woman Martha gave Tina a look that could have curdled milk. Was she now? Well, she's too late. The store's being sold to pay off Bart's debts. The house was never finished. There's nothing for her here. Each sentence was a hammer blow methodically demolishing the last vestiges of Tina's hope. Debts, Bart's letters had spoken only of success. Another crack appeared in the foundation of the man she thought she knew. Tears pricked at the corners of Tina's eyes, hot and shameful. She would not cry. Not here, not in front of these callous, unwelcoming people. She lifted her chin, her pride a flimsy shield against the utter desolation of her circumstances. "I see," she said, her voice trembling only slightly. "Thank you for your candor." She turned her mind a blank slate. Where could she go? Back to Boston. She had sold nearly everything she owned to pay for her ticket west. The few coins in her purse wouldn't even buy her a meal, let alone passage back across the country. The stagecoach was already preparing to leave, the driver hitching up a fresh team of horses. Her last link to the world she knew was about to vanish. Panic, cold and sharp, began to set in. She was trapped. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, a man who had been watching the scene unfold from the far side of the street finally moved. He pushed himself off the post he'd been leaning against and walked towards them. He moved with an easy, unhurried grace that seemed at odds with the tense tableau. He was tall, with broad shoulders that filled out his dusty brown shirt. His face was weathered by the sun, with kind lines etched around his eyes. He wore a worn Stetson, its brim low, but not low enough to hide the intelligent, steady gaze that seemed to take in everything at once. He stopped a few feet away, his attention fixed on Tina. "Sheriff," he said, his voice a low baritone, calm and steady. It was the first gentle sound she had heard since arriving. "Martha." "Leave the lady be." Martha sniffed, indignant. "She's got no business here, Camden. You know that. That ain't for you to decide." The man Camden replied, his voice even, but with an undercurrent of steel that made the woman press her lips into a thin line. His gaze returned to Tina. "Ma'am," he said politely, touching the brim of his hat. "My name is Camden Wells. I was a friend of Bart's." At the mention of his friendship with Bartholomew, a fresh wave of grief, raw and real, washed over Tina. This man had known him, had spoken with him, had perhaps shared a drink with him. He was a tangible link to the ghost she had traveled so far to marry. "I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this." Camden continued, his eyes full of a genuine sorrow that was a stark contrast to the sheriff's hollow platitudes. "Bart he was a good man. He spoke of you often, was looking forward to your arrival more than anything." The simple, kind words were almost her undoing. She bit her lip hard, fighting for control. "The thing is," Miss Brooks Camden said, his gaze sweeping over the hostile faces watching them this town, "it ain't always the most welcoming place for a stranger in a tough spot." He looked directly at her, his expression serious. "You have nowhere to go." It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact. She could only shake her head, the movement barely perceptible. He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "I have a ranch a few miles out of town. It's quiet. I have a small spare room. It ain't much, but it's clean and it's safe. You could stay there, just until you can get your bearings, figure out what's next." The offer was so unexpected, so contrary to the reception she had received thus far, that Tina was momentarily stunned into silence. The sheriff shifted on his feet, looking uncomfortable. Martha let out an audible gasp of disapproval. Camden Martha hissed, "Have you lost your senses? A single woman in your house. It's not proper. It's more proper than leaving her to sleep on the street." Martha Camden shot back, his voice hardening. "Which one of you is going to offer her a bed for the night?" He looked from Martha to the sheriff, who suddenly found the toe of his boot intensely interesting. Silence was his answer. He turned back to Tina, his expression softening once more. "The offer is a decent one, ma'am. I'll keep to myself. You'll have your privacy. I can't in good conscience ride away and leave you here like this." Bart wouldn't have wanted that. She looked into his eyes, searching for any sign of guile, of ill intent. She saw none. What she saw was a profound weariness, a sadness that seemed to dwell deep within him, but also a quiet strength and a decency that felt as solid and real as the sun-baked earth beneath her feet. She had no money, no friends, no prospects. Her other option was to be utterly at the mercy of strangers who had already judged and dismissed her. This man, this Camden Wells, was offering her a sanctuary, however temporary. He was offering her compassion when she had found none. With the last of her courage, she made a choice. "Thank you, Mr. Wells," she said, her voice quiet but clear. I would be very grateful to accept your offer." Camden gave a slow, solemn nod. "Camden is fine," he said. He turned, retrieved her large trunk with an ease that belied its weight, and then picked up her smaller suitcase. "My wagon is just over here. We can be there before dark." As she followed him, leaving the sheriff and a sputtering Martha on the boardwalk, Tina felt the weight of the town's eyes on her back. They were no longer just curious or hostile. Now they were filled with suspicion. She was walking away with Camden Wells, a man who, by his own admission, was a friend of her dead fiancé. As she took her seat on the hard wooden bench of his wagon, a disquieting thought wormed its way into her mind. In the stories, a compassionate stranger was a hero, a savior. But out here in the vast, unforgiving West, she had a sudden chilling feeling that kindness, like everything else, might come with a hidden price. The official story was an accident, but the coldness of the town, Martha's sharp words about debts, and Camden's sudden solemn intervention, it didn't quite add up. She was a mail-order bride who had arrived late only to find herself homeless. But as the wagon rattled out of town away from the prying eyes, she began to suspect she had stumbled into a far more dangerous story than she could ever have imagined. Camden Wells's ranch was nestled in a shallow valley cradled by low, sage-dusted hills that seemed to hold the last of the day's warmth long after the sun had dipped below the horizon. It wasn't a grand operation, not by the standards of the cattle barons, whose names were whispered with a mixture of awe and fear. There was a sturdy, modest ranch house built of sun-bleached timber, a solid-looking barn, and a series of corrals, all of it neat and well-maintained. A sense of quiet order reigned over the place, a stark contrast to the chaotic jumble of her emotions. Camden didn't speak much on the ride out, his attention seemingly focused on the trail, his hands guiding the horses with a gentle, practiced confidence. The silence was a balm to Tina's frayed nerves, allowing the initial shock to recede into a dull, throbbing ache of grief and bewilderment. She stole glances at him, at the strong line of his jaw, and the sadness that seemed to permanently reside in his deep-set eyes. He had offered her shelter, but he had not offered her easy comfort or false platitudes, and for that she was strangely grateful. "The house has 2 rooms," he said as he pulled the wagon to a stop near the front porch. "The main room and a bedroom. You'll take the bedroom. I'll make do on the cot in here." He gestured to the main living space. He carried her trunk inside as if it weighed nothing, setting it down gently at the foot of a simple but solid wooden bed frame. The room was sparse, almost monastic. The bed was covered with a thick, colorful quilt. A small wooden nightstand stood beside it, and a simple wash basin and pitcher sat on a chest of drawers. But it was impeccably clean. The floor swept the air smelling of dried herbs and wood smoke, not of dust and neglect. It was more than she could have hoped for. "Thank you, Camden," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "You have no idea what this means." He just nodded his gaze, lingering on her for a moment, before he retreated, pulling the door almost closed to give her privacy. "There's water in the pitcher if you'd like to wash up. I'll see to some supper." Alone, the dam of her composure finally broke. She sank onto the edge of the bed, the unfamiliar quilt soft beneath her trembling fingers, and wept. She wept for the man she'd never met, but whose words had given her hope. She wept for the life that had been stolen from her before it had even begun, and she wept with the terrifying uncertainty of what was to come. She was a stranger in a strange land, living under the roof of a man she did not know. A man who was friends with her dead fiancé. Over the next few days, a fragile, unspoken routine began to form. Tina, desperate to contribute to not feel like a complete burden, took over the cooking and the small domestic chores of the house. She was a capable cook, a skill honed by years of necessity, and she found a quiet satisfaction in transforming Camden's bachelor supplies of flour beans and salted pork into savory stews and fresh bread baked in the cast-iron stove. Camden, in turn, was a ghost of a host. He rose before the sun, his quiet movements barely disturbing her, and was out of the house before she even lit the morning fire. He would work all day mending fences, tending to his small herd of cattle, his tall frame a distant, solitary figure against the vast landscape. He returned only at dusk, weary and covered in the dust of his labor. They ate their meals in a thick, weighty silence. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence precisely, but it was filled with unasked questions. Tina found herself studying him across the small wooden table. She noticed the way his hands, though calloused and rough, were gentle with any object they touched. She saw the exhaustion in the slump of his shoulders and the deep, abiding sorrow in his eyes that never seemed to leave even when he offered a rare, fleeting smile. He never spoke of Bartholomew, and she, in turn, was afraid to ask. The subject felt like a deep wound, one she was hesitant to probe for fear of the pain it might cause both of them. But Bartholomew's ghost lingered between them, a constant, unseen presence. One afternoon, needing a few supplies, Tina convinced Camden to let her accompany him into Promise. She dreaded facing the town again, but the thought of being cooped up at the ranch alone with her thoughts was even more daunting. As their wagon rolled down the main street, she felt the same hostile stares as before. Whispers followed them like burrs on a saddle blanket. She saw Martha, the woman from the mercantile, standing with two other townswomen. Their heads were close together, and their sharp, venomous glances in her direction were unmistakable. Tina felt a flush of shame and anger. What were they saying? That she had immediately thrown herself at her dead fiancé's friend, that she was a woman of loose morals. Camden seemed to sense her distress. "Pay them no mind, Tina," he said, his voice low. "Their lives are small. They fill them with talk." While Camden conducted his business at the blacksmith's, Tina gathered her courage and entered the Higgins Mercantile. A pasty-faced young man she hadn't seen before stood behind the counter nervously arranging tins of peaches. The store felt different. It was Bart's store, but the life seemed to have gone out of it. "Can I help you, ma'am?" the young man asked, avoiding her eyes. "I'd like some flour and coffee, please," she said quietly. As he measured out the goods, she took a steadying breath. I am Tina Brooks. I was to be Mr. Higgins's wife." The young man flinched, dropping the scoop. Flour puffed up in a white cloud. Oh, I'm sorry, ma'am. I heard. Terrible business. You worked for him?" "Yes, ma'am. Name's William. Mr. Higgins hired me on about 6 months back." An idea reckless and sudden took hold of her. "William." She began, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "The sheriff said it was an accident, that his horse was spooked by a snake." William's eyes darted towards the front window as if expecting to see someone listening. He began sweeping the spilled flour with frantic, jerky movements. "That's right, ma'am. That's what Sheriff Miller said. A tragic accident." His repetition of the official story was too quick, too rote. "But what do you think?" she pressed gently. He stopped, his knuckles white on the handle of the broom. He looked at her, his young face a mask of fear and indecision. "It ain't my place to think, ma'am," he whispered. "But Mr. Higgins was a fine horseman, best I've ever seen. And that horse of his, Pegasus? Steady as a rock. I saw a snake on the trail once with him, a big rattler. Pegasus just flicked his ears and stepped right on by. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. And another thing, Mr. Higgins wasn't himself the last month or so. Worried, always looking over his shoulder. He told me if anything ever happened to him, I should—" He trailed off, his eyes wide with fear. "What, William? What did he tell you to do?" Before he could answer, the bell above the door jangled harshly. A large, imposing figure filled the doorway, blocking the afternoon light. The man was dressed in expensive tailored riding clothes, a stark contrast to the dusty workwear of the other men in town. He had a thick neck, a florid face, and cold, pale blue eyes that swept the store with an air of ownership. "Afternoon, boy!" The man boomed, his voice dripping with condescension. "Get me a box of those Cuban cigars." William jumped as if struck. "Yes, Mr. Montgomery. Right away, sir." The man, Silas Montgomery, turned his cold gaze on Tina. He looked her up and down, a slow, insolent appraisal that made her skin crawl. Well, well, and who is this pretty little flower wilting in the dust? This is Miss Brooks, sir, William stammered, placing the box of cigars on the counter. She was a friend of Mr. Higgins. Montgomery laughed, a short, ugly sound. A friend, you say? I heard she was the mail-order bride come to collect on a dead man's promises. His eyes glinted with malice. You're a little late to the party, sweetheart. The man is dead, and his assets are being liquidated to pay his outstanding debts. He smiled a predator's smile that didn't reach his eyes. Mostly to me. So this was him, the man Martha had mentioned, the one to whom Bart owed money. Silas Montgomery. He radiated a palpable aura of menace and power. You're staying out at the Wells place, I hear. Montgomery continued, his tone turning oily. Camden Wells, always playing the righteous hero. You be careful of him, missy. Men who act that noble usually have something to hide. He leaned closer, his voice dropping. Bart Higgins learned the hard way that you can't trust everyone in this town. With a final lingering look, he tossed a coin on the counter, took his cigars, and strode out of the store. The oppressive atmosphere lifted the moment he was gone. Tina's hands were shaking. She looked at William, whose face was ashen. William, what was he like? Bart's relationship with Mr. Montgomery. William wouldn't meet her eyes. Mr. Higgins. He was afraid of him, ma'am. Real afraid. Everyone is. He shook his head, looking miserable. Please, ma'am, don't ask me any more. I've got a family to think of. She paid for her goods, her mind reeling. A fine horseman, steady as a rock. Worried, afraid of Montgomery. The pieces didn't fit the simple narrative of an accident. They pointed to something darker, something hidden beneath the surface of this quiet town. When she returned to the wagon, Camden took one look at her pale face and knew something was wrong. What is it? I met Silas Montgomery, she said, her voice small. Camden's entire body went rigid. His hands tightened on the reins, his jaw clenching so hard a muscle jumped. Stay away from him, Tina, he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl she had never heard before. He's poison. He said Bart owed him money. He said I should be careful of you, that you might be hiding something. The words were out before she could stop them. The wagon rattled along in a tense silence. The easy quiet of the ride into town had been shattered, replaced by suspicion and fear. Camden stared straight ahead, his face a granite mask. What are you hiding, Camden? She finally asked, her heart pounding. What really happened to Bartholomew? He pulled the wagon to a sudden stop. The only sounds were the jingle of the harness and the sigh of the wind through the sagebrush. He finally turned to look at her, and the sorrow in his eyes was so profound it stole her breath. I am hiding the fact that Bart was my best friend, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I'm hiding the fact that the night he died, he came to my ranch. He was terrified. He said Montgomery had threatened him, said he'd ruin him, take everything he had if Bart didn't sign over the deed to his land. His land. Why did Montgomery want his land so badly? Walter Camden said grimly. There's a hidden spring on Bart's property. In this country, water is more valuable than gold. With that spring, Montgomery could expand his herds, choke out every other small rancher in this valley, including me. He looked away, his gaze fixed on the distant hazy mountains. Bart wanted to go to the sheriff. I told him not to. I told him Sheriff Miller was in Montgomery's pocket. I told him to lay low, to let me think of a way to help him. He was scared. We argued. He accused me of being a coward, of not wanting to risk my own skin to help him. Camden's voice cracked. He rode off, angry, and that was the last time I saw him alive. He finally looked at her, his face a portrait of guilt and regret. So yes, Miss Brooks, I am hiding something. I'm hiding the fact that I let my best friend ride out of my yard alone and terrified into the night. And now he's dead. Maybe if I'd gone with him, maybe if I'd just listened, he'd still be here. And you would have the life you were promised. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and devastating. It was not the admission of guilt she had half feared, but something far more complex and heartbreaking. It was a confession of failure, of regret, so deep it had hollowed him out. Montgomery's insinuations had been a twisted, cruel version of the truth. Camden wasn't hiding a crime. He was hiding his shame. His compassion towards her was not just pity. It was penance. In that moment, looking at the immense pain in this quiet, solitary man's face, Tina knew two things with absolute certainty. First, Bartholomew Higgins's death was no accident. And second, she and Camden Wells were no longer just a mail-order bride and her reluctant host. They were allies bound together by the ghost of a man they had both in their own ways cared for, and by the dangerous shadow of Silas Montgomery that loomed over them both. The fragile peace of the ranch had been broken, but in its place, something stronger and infinitely more perilous was beginning to grow. The wake of Camden's confession was a sea change. The heavy silence that had defined their cohabitation was replaced by the low, urgent murmur of conversation. The ghost of Bartholomew Higgins, once a barrier between them, was now the very foundation of their fragile alliance. The shared knowledge of the truth, or at least the suspicion of it, forged a bond that their strange circumstances alone could not. Tina saw Camden in a new light. His quietness was not aloofness, but a self-imposed exile born of guilt. His solitude was a penance. She found her grief for Bartholomew mingling with a burgeoning fierce desire for justice. The man she had corresponded with, the one who had written of hope and honest work, had been bullied and terrified, his life likely forfeit for a patch of land and a hidden spring. "We can't let him get away with it," she said. One evening her hands clenched in her lap as they sat at the small kitchen table, the flickering lamplight casting long shadows on the walls. Camden looked up from the harness buckle he was mending, his expression grim. "Tina, you don't understand. Silas Montgomery is the law in this valley. He owns the sheriff. He holds the debts of half the men in town. To go against him is not just foolish, it's suicide. So we do nothing." She challenged, her voice rising with indignation. "We let him win. We let him murder a good man and steal what was his. What kind of life is that? Camden, living in fear, always looking over your shoulder." Her words echoed the description William had given of Bart's last days. Camden's hands stilled. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time she saw something other than sorrow in his eyes. It was a flicker of the fire he worked so hard to bank a hint of the man he was, before guilt had become his constant companion. "What do you propose we do, march into town and accuse him?" "We have no proof. It's my word, the word of a man who argued with Bart the night he died against the most powerful man for 100 miles. Then we find proof," she stated, her resolve hardening. It was a reckless idea born of a Bostonian sense of order and justice that had little place in this wild land. But it was the only thing she could cling to. Their quest for proof began with a clandestine return to the Higgins Mercantile. Under the cover of a moonless night, Camden led Tina through the back alleys of Promise. The town she had seen in the harsh light of day was now a place of menacing shadows and furtive whispers. Every creak of a floorboard, every distant howl of a coyote sent a jolt of fear through her. Camden, however, moved with a silent, predatory grace. He was a part of the darkness, not an intruder in it. He picked the lock on the back door of the Mercantile with a deftness that hinted at a past more complicated than that of a simple rancher. "Where did you learn to do that?" she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "You don't survive out here without learning a few things you don't talk about in church. was his only tight-lipped reply. Inside the store was dark and smelled of dust coffee beans and old wood. It felt like a tomb. "What are we looking for?" Camden asked, his voice a low rumble. "I don't know," Tina admitted. "Anything. A journal, a ledger letters. Anything that might show what was happening between Bart and Montgomery." They searched with a frantic, whispered intensity. Camden checked the main desk and the drawers beneath the counter while Tina made her way to the small, cramped office at the back. It was Bart's personal space, and being in it felt like a profound violation. His pipe was still in an ashtray on the desk, a faint, sweet tobacco scent lingering in the air. A half-finished letter to his sister in Ohio lay on the blotter. Her fingers trembled as she sifted through stacks of invoices and receipts. Most of it was mundane, the ordinary paperwork of a small business. But then tucked away in the bottom drawer of his desk, beneath a stack of old catalogs, her fingers brushed against a small leather-bound book. It was a ledger, but instead of neat columns of figures and inventory, the pages were filled with Bart's familiar strong script, dense and hurried. It wasn't a business ledger. It was a personal journal. "Camden," she breathed, her voice barely audible. He was at her side in an instant. Using a match to light the office lantern, they huddled over the book, the small pool of light illuminating the desperate words on the page. October 12th. The first entry she found read, "Montgomery was in the store again today. He no longer bothers with the pretense of shopping. He came to remind me of my debt. The loan I took from him to expand the store was a fool's bargain. The interest he charges is a hangman's noose, and he delights in tightening it inch by inch." They scanned through the pages, a timeline of mounting terror. Bart wrote of Montgomery's men driving cattle across his grazing land, of a fence being mysteriously cut, of whispers and threats. He wrote of his discovery of the spring, his initial hope that it would be his salvation, a way to sell water rights and finally free himself from Montgomery's clutches. But his hope had quickly turned to dread. November 3rd. He knows about the spring. I don't know how, but he knows. He is no longer interested in the money. He wants the land. He offered to buy me out for pennies on the dollar. When I refused, he laughed. He said I would sign it over one way or another. I saw something in his eyes. He is not a man who makes idle threats. I feel like a fly caught in a spider's web. The final entry was dated the day of his death, November 15th. He gave me an ultimatum: sign the deed by the end of the week, or my sister in Ohio will receive word of my tragic accidental death. He said it with a smile. God help me, he was smiling. I am going to see Camden. He is the only one I can trust. He is a good man, a strong man. Maybe he will see a way out of this that I cannot. Tina's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a sob. The last words Bart had written about Camden were a testament to their friendship, a stark, painful contrast to the guilt Camden carried. He was coming to you for help, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. He trusted you. Camden's face was pale, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. He gently took the journal from her hands, his touch reverent. "And I sent him away angry," he said, his voice thick with self-loathing. This is the proof, Tina. But it's still not enough. It's his word in a private book. Montgomery will say I forged it, that you and I conspired to frame him. So what do we do? He mentioned a deed. Camden said, his mind clearly working, piecing things together. If Bart wouldn't sign it, Montgomery would need to forge his signature. A forged deed would be real, tangible proof of his crime. It would have to be filed at the county records office in Carson City. But he's dead, Tina countered. How could he file a forged deed now? He wouldn't, Camden said, a dark realization dawning in his eyes. He'd have a backdated bill of sale. He'd claim Bart signed it over the day before he died. He's just been waiting for the dust to settle, waiting for the mail-order bride to arrive and be sent packing, so no one with a legitimate claim to Bart's property was left. Her arrival hadn't just made her homeless. It had made her an obstacle, a dangerous one. Suddenly, the back door of the mercantile creaked open. They both froze, plunging the lantern and dousing the light. Heavy footsteps entered the store. "See anything?" a rough voice asked. It was one of Montgomery's men, a hulking brute named Pike she had seen lurking around the saloon. "Nothing," another voice replied. "Probably just the wind. Still, Montgomery wants us to keep an eye on the place, especially with that woman still sniffing around." Tina's blood ran cold. They were being watched. Montgomery knew she was a threat. They waited in the suffocating darkness of the small office, barely daring to breathe, until the footsteps receded and the back door clicked shut. The journal felt like a burning coal in Camden's hands. "We have to get this out of town," he whispered, his voice urgent. "We have to get it to someone who can't be bought. A federal marshal, maybe." "How I know a man," Camden said after a long moment. "An old friend. Runs a relay station 2 days' ride from here. He can get a message to the right people." He looked at her, his face grim. "But one of us has to stay here. If we both disappear, Montgomery will know we're on to him. He'll send his men after us, and we'll never make it." The unspoken choice hung in the air. He was the better rider, the one who knew the terrain, the one who stood the best chance of getting through. That meant she had to stay. Alone. "I'll stay," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "You have to go, Camden. You have to do this. For Bart." He looked at her, a complex mixture of fear and admiration in his eyes. "Tina, it's too dangerous. Pike and his men will be watching you. I'll be careful. I'll stay at the ranch. I won't go into town." She placed a hand on his arm, her touch surprisingly firm. "Go, and ride fast." The ride back to the ranch was a blur of adrenaline and fear. They secreted the journal in Camden's saddlebags. As the first pale light of dawn broke over the eastern hills, he was ready to leave. He stood before her, his horse saddled and waiting, the weight of their dangerous gamble settling upon them. "Be safe, Tina," he said, his voice low and earnest. He reached out his calloused hand, gently touching her cheek. It was the first time he had touched her with such tenderness, and a jolt went through her that had nothing to do with fear. It was a spark of connection, of shared purpose, and a deep, unspoken understanding. "You too." "Camden?" she whispered. She watched him ride away, a solitary figure disappearing into the vast, unforgiving landscape, the fate of their endeavor, and perhaps their very lives, resting on his shoulders. As his silhouette vanished over the rise, a profound sense of loneliness washed over her. She was truly alone now, a lone woman in a house that wasn't hers, a target for a man who had already killed once to get what he wanted. The truth was unraveled, but the most dangerous part of their story was just beginning. The 2 days following Camden's departure were a crucible of silence and fear. Tina existed in a state of high alert, starting at every creak of the house, the heavy Colt revolver Camden had left her, never far from her hand. The weight of it was a terrifying, solid presence in the lonely quiet. She read Bartholomew's journal until the words were etched into her memory, his fear fueling her resolve. She was no longer just a victim of circumstance. She was a guardian of his story. On the afternoon of the second day, a dust cloud on the horizon resolved into 3 riders. Her heart hammered against her ribs. It was too soon for Camden. Peering through the curtain, she saw Silas Montgomery flanked by his hired thugs, Pike and another hard-faced man. They rode with an arrogant slowness, as if they owned the very air she breathed. Panic, cold and sharp, threatened to overwhelm her. She was alone. Taking a shuddering breath, she clutched the revolver, its grip cool against her damp palm. She would not cower. Montgomery dismounted and strode onto the porch. He didn't bother to knock, simply rattling the barred door. "Miss Brooks," he called, his voice a menacing purr. "I know you're in there. We need to talk." Tina remained silent, her back pressed to the wall, the heavy pistol raised in her shaking hands. "Don't be difficult." Montgomery's voice hardened. "I have a generous offer, a train ticket back east, a pocket full of cash. All you have to do is sign a quitclaim deed relinquishing any interest in the Higgins property. This was his endgame. He needed to legally erase her, the last obstacle to his theft. "His property is nothing to me?" she shouted, her voice trembling. "Take it and go," Montgomery chuckled. "It's not about the property, my dear. It's about the water beneath it. You will sign the paper, or my men and I will wait for your cowboy protector to return. And I assure you the conversation will be much less pleasant for you both." The threat hung in the air, a hangman's noose. If she refused, Camden would ride straight into a fatal ambush. As despair washed over her, she heard it, a single sharp whistle from the hills behind the house. It was the bird call signal Camden had taught her. "I'm here. Create a distraction." Hope, fierce and desperate, surged through her. He hadn't abandoned her. He had outmaneuvered them. She had to give him time. "All right, Mr. Montgomery," she called, feigning resignation. "I'll sign." "A wise decision," he said smugly. Pike break down the door. As the big man lowered his shoulder, Tina acted. Aiming at the ceiling, she squeezed the trigger. The gunshot was a deafening explosion in the small house, the recoil sending the Colt clattering to the floor. Outside, Montgomery cursed as his men scrambled for cover. It was the only distraction she could offer. She prayed it was enough. From the window, she saw Pike and the other man draw their guns, their attention fixed on the house. They hadn't seen Camden rising like a specter from the rocks behind the barn, a rifle at his shoulder. The first crack of his rifle kicked dust from Pike's boot. The ranch erupted into a cacophony of gunfire. Tina crawled to the floor as bullets splintered the window frame. Camden, from his superior position, was a master of controlled violence. He wasn't shooting to kill, but to disarm and disable. A shot shattered one man's rifle stock. Another sent Montgomery's hat flying. "He's just one man!" Montgomery roared, his face purple with fury. "Rush the house! Get the woman!" As Pike made a break for the porch, the thunder of approaching horses filled the valley. For a moment, Tina feared Montgomery had reinforcements. But as the riders crested the hill, she saw the glint of tin stars on their vests. Leading them was a tall, grim-faced federal marshal. Camden hadn't ridden for a distant relay station. He'd ridden through the night to the railhead, caught a train to Carson City, and delivered Bart's journal into the hands of federal lawmen. He had gambled everything on speed and the integrity of a power greater than Montgomery's. The sight of the marshals broke the will of Montgomery's men. They threw down their guns, hands in the air. Montgomery, however, was consumed by a black-cornered rage. He saw his empire of fear crumbling. He spun his face a mask of hate and leveled his pistol not at the lawmen, but at the house, at her. "If I'm ruined, you're coming with me," he screamed. Before he could fire, Camden's rifle cracked one last time. The bullet shattered Montgomery's wrist, sending his pistol flying. He shrieked in a harmony of agony and defeat. Silence fell absolute and sudden, broken only by the pounding of hooves as the marshals swarmed the yard. Tina threw the bar from the door and stumbled onto the porch. Camden met her there, and without a word, she was in his arms, his solid presence a safe harbor in the storm. He held her tightly, stroking her hair as she buried her face in his dusty shirt. "It's over, Tina," he murmured. "It's over." The lead marshal, a stern man named Franklin, clapped Montgomery in irons. "Silas Montgomery," he said, his voice ringing with authority, "you are under arrest for fraud conspiracy and suspicion of the murder of Bartholomew Higgins." This journal, he held up the leather book along with the forged bill of sale we found in your safe, should be enough to see you hang. As they led a broken, snarling Montgomery away, the townsfolk of Promise began to appear, drawn by the battle. They stood in a wide, silent circle, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning comprehension. They saw the federal marshals, the captured tyrant, and the two figures standing on the porch, the mail-order bride they had scorned, and the quiet cowboy they had so foolishly underestimated. In the following days, the truth settled over the valley like a cleansing rain. Bartholomew Higgins's name was cleared, and Tina, by right of his intention, was legally recognized as the owner of his mercantile and the small plot of land with its precious spring. She was no longer a destitute outcast, but a woman of property in the town that had rejected her. A week later, she stood with Camden on the porch, gazing at the landscape that now held her future. "You took an incredible risk," she said softly. "Some things are worth risking everything for." He replied, his gaze not on the valley, but on her. The guilt he had carried for so long was finally gone from his eyes, replaced by a clear, hopeful light. "I came here looking for a home, a life with a man I knew only from letters," Tina said, a sense of wonder in her voice. "I found something else entirely." "What did you find?" Camden asked. She looked up at this quiet, courageous man who had offered a stranger compassion and had faced down a killer for the sake of a friend. "I found my home," she said. He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. Their grip was firm, their shared future as vast and full of promise as the western sky stretching out before them. They had both begun their story with loss, but here in the dust and sunlight they had found their reckoning, and with it a love forged not by contract, but by courage. Tina Brooks's journey into the heart of the West began with a broken promise and a fresh grave, but it didn't end there. In the face of a town's cold shoulder and a powerful man's murderous greed, she discovered a strength she never knew she possessed. And in the quiet compassion of a guilt-ridden cowboy named Camden Wells, she found more than just a roof over her head. She found a partner in a fight for justice and a love worth risking everything for. Theirs is a story that proves that even in the harshest of landscapes, hope can blossom. Courage can rewrite fate, and the most unexpected paths can lead us exactly where we were always meant to be. If Tina and Camden's struggle for justice in the dusty town of Promise captured your heart, please show your support by hitting that like button, sharing this story with fellow history lovers, and subscribing to our channel for more tales of resilience, romance, and reckoning from the untamed Wild West.